So I'm going to lecture today about the nitrogen cycle. And these are the big issues that I wanted to get across today. First of all, just because we're talking about global biochemical cycles, I wanted to make sure that we have just a basic understanding of how to think about matter and energy moving at global scales. So just some real simple terminology. Rates, pools, turnover rates, residence times. Just basically boxes and arrows and the different ways they relate to each other. And talking about the nitrogen cycle. So the chemical nature of nitrogen, most of the nitrogen is N2 gas, which is really inert, so why it's important. Talk about the major steps in the nitrogen cycle, how humans are messing it up, and what the consequences are. At various levels, ecosystems, climate, so that's pretty much what we're going for today. So first, just some considerations of words that will pop up when we're talking about global cycles. So a pool means an amount of a particular type of substance, in this case we're talking about nitrogen, in a specific location or state. So the atmospheric nitrogen pool, how much nitrogen gas is there in the atmosphere, how much nitrogen is there in the soil. So it's a static, it's referring to an amount. And normally you see it as a box. So that's a pool. This is 5 times 10 to the 12 grams. Also, we're dealing with really large units in general. A teragram is 10 to the 12. In the carbon cycle, you'll see 10 to the 15, which is a petagram. Anyway, then a flux means a rate, something moving in or out of a pool. And so basically, those would be in mass per unit time. So there's flux into this pool, teragram per year, flux out, the same flux, 10 to the 12 grams per year, another teragram per year. So the first approximation, most global cycles are in steady state. Humans are messing things up and changing things a little bit every year. But to the first approximation, mostly, so the amount of nitrogen going into the atmosphere and coming out of the atmosphere, for example, in any given year, it's roughly the same. And so, in steady state, it makes certain things easier to calculate. So you can say, what's the mean residence time? You divide the pool by the flux going in or out of it. And so the mean residence time is on average how long does a molecule spend in that pool. So you have grams divided by grams per year. So do the algebra, we find out that the resulting thing is in years. Right? So grams divided by grams per year. It's the same as grams times years over grams. Grams cancel out 8 years. So that's a mean residence time. And a turnover rate is another way of saying the same thing. It's how quickly is that pool turning over and being replaced. So that is just, that would be the rate divided by the pool. So, but they get you at the same concepts. But these are things that they're useful when we're talking about big global cycles and how quickly things are turning over. So, just in case I use any of these terms, like pools and fluxes, there's a slide showing what it means. All right. This will all be okay. Okay, so the nitrogen cycle, a few important aspects of it. First of all, the chemistry. So the nitrogen cycle is it's complex and interesting and dynamic for a few reasons, mainly because of the chemistry of nitrogen. It has gaseous forms, so all this stuff, 80% of what I'm waving my arms through is nitrogen gas, but it also has NO, NO2, N2O, various gaseous forms. Even ammonia can have a volatile form. And so, because it has many gaseous forms, it's transported around the planet, and that makes it a more dynamic, interesting cycle. Many oxidation states, so it goes from the most oxidized state, which is nitrate, NO3 minus, to ammonium, or ammonium NH4 plus, or NH3, same thing depending on the pH. That's the most reduced form, and many things in between. This is interesting, mainly from the microbial point of view. Microbes are constantly driving these changes in oxidation state for their own metabolism. If you were to take my microbial ecology class, I'd torture you with all the details on that, because it really gets into microbial physiology, how they make a living. Microbes are they're oxidizing things for energy and donating electrons to things for anaerobic respiration. They drive a lot of the biochemical cycle. Nitrogen is most of the steps, and we're going to really simplify it for this class, but many of the transformations in the nitrogen cycle are driven by microbes that are making a living oxidizing and reducing nitrogen. The triple bond, so that nitrogen-nitrogen triple bond, is a really important aspect of the nitrogen cycle because it's so non-reactive. It takes a lot of energy to split that bond. We'll see that in pre-industrial days, there are microbes that can do it, they spend a lot of energy, and then there's lightning. Now we can invest lots of fossil fuels in the Haber-Bosch process to make heat and pressure, and we can get the N2 bonds to break. But for the most part, it's really non-reactive, and so we have this sort of paradoxical situation where nitrogen is a strongly limiting reagent, or limiting nutrient in many ecosystems, even though we're surrounded by nitrogen all the time. So this is the most commonly limiting nutrient, probably in general on the planet. It's specifically a limiting nutrient. So when I say limiting, I better make sure I know. You probably already had a unit on primary productivity. And did you talk about limiting nutrients? So in other words, when I'm talking about limiting nutrient, I mean the one nutrient that if you add it, you'll get a growth response. Usually, at least an individual plant is going to be limited by a single nutrient. You can get a little bit more complicated when you talk about the community, because there'll be different plants that might be limited by different things. But at the ecosystem level, if you were to dump nitrogen on most terrestrial ecosystems in temperate zones, you get a growth response. In the tropics, phosphorus is more important in freshwater lake systems. Also the ocean seems to be strongly nitrogen limited, although there's some interesting stuff looking at iron and silica and how those micronutrients can increase productivity. But anyway, nitrogen, extremely important. By the way, why is it important? What's nitrogen a part of? The cells. Yeah, amino acids, that's the number one thing, proteins. There's other things too, like nucleic acids, DNA, but cells have a lot of protein for in a functional state. Most of nitrogen is going to be in the form of protein. Okay, so internal cycling. This is the point out the next slide will show you the global nitrogen cycle. Because it's so hard to fix nitrogen, to convert it from an atmospheric form into a reactive form, it turns out that internal cycling, so cycling from inorganic forms into organic matter, and then breaking down, recycling nitrogen from the decomposition of organic matter, is very important in ecosystems, most ecosystems. And then again, that relates to this triple bond in a lot of ways. So, this is an out-of-date figure, but it is one from your textbook. And I actually still like this figure because it is more simple than the up-to-date figures. These numbers have changed, both because the human impacts are growing, and also because as more research accumulates, we get better estimates of these numbers. But this gives you the big picture, and it's not quite as confusing as the ones that I'll show you a few slides down the road from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where they brought together the most recent information. This gives you the big picture. So we're talking about units of 10 to the 12 grams per year, teragrams per year, big T. The human activities, this is the thing that we'll see in the later slides, it's gone way, way up. But already, even back in this 2001 version of the textbook, it was using a 1997 slide, humans are adding a lot of nitrogen to the nitrogen cycle. But you can see this internal cycling I'm talking about. Land plants take up about 1,200 teragrams per year, and that is pretty much in steady state. That's how much, so plants take it up, their leaves fall, it gets degraded by microbes, worms, insects, all that, and that's cycling within the system. And you see that number is much larger than what goes in for biological nitrogen fixation. That's the biological process that converts N2 gas to usable forms of nitrogen. So you can see that, roughly speaking, this is about a tenth, or an eighth, as much as what's cycling internally. In the ocean, even more so. There's like 8,000 teragrams cycling, so that's uptake and breakdown of nitrogen into algae being recycled by microbes compared to biological fixation yield. So what this means is in most ecosystems, plants get the majority of their nitrogen from the recycling of organic matter that's in the soil, or in the water column in case of the ocean. If you remember back, presumably you've studied things like primary and secondary succession earlier in this class. That's where you might find some exceptions. If you're colonizing a brand new soil and there's no soil organic matter, some of those first plants that would colonize those environments are nitrogen fixers. We probably talked about that earlier. So that would be an example of an ecosystem where you actually rely more on biological nitrogen fixation. They fix nitrogen, soil nitrogen accumulates, and then eventually those things get replaced by other plants that can't fix nitrogen, grow more efficiently. So anyway, but speaking globally, this internal cycling is more important than fixation. Although obviously this is important on how the nitrogen gets into the soil in the first place. Okay, what else is happening? Denitrification, another very important process driven by microbes. It's called denitrification because it's removing nitrogen from ecosystems back into gaseous forms that go into the atmosphere. So they can go back to N2 gas or to intermediate nitrogen forms like N2O, which is a strong greenhouse gas. I'll talk about that in more detail. And so you have nitrogen going into and out of the atmosphere, or from the atmosphere to the soil and back out. So before industrial times, there was a little bit of nitrogen fixed just from lightning strikes. But now we're overwhelming that amount with intentional and non-intentional fertilization. So we're producing fertilizer industrially, but then there's also internal combustion engine and things like that. Okay, so that gives you the big picture. And we're going to see what the consequences are of humans adding a lot more of this reactive nitrogen to the system. So the total amount of nitrogen on the planet hasn't really changed, but we're taking this huge pool that's in the atmosphere and converting it into forms that cycle through the biology. This is why the impacts that has. So again, if this were one microbial ecology class, I'd add this with even a more scary diagram and learn all about the details of the microbes that are carrying this out. But I want you to at least see how this works. This is looking at different oxidation states of nitrogen and what processes convert them between these forms and why they're important. So this first one, N2 to ammonium, that's nitrogen fixation, atmospheric nitrogen fixation. So it's carried out by microbes, bacteria, and archaea. There's a lot of plants that have symbioses, they have mutualisms with these things, and I'll talk about their importance on the planet. But that's strictly carried out actually by prokaryotic organisms. It takes this really inert type of gas that doesn't react with anything, invests a lot of energy, and you get this useful ammonium coming out. These next two steps are both called nitrification because the end product is nitrate. I have them separated out mainly because there's two separate microbial groups that do it. There's the first step are the ammonia oxidizers making nitrite, and then the nitrate oxidizers. In this process, some N2O gas, nitrous oxide, is released. This is important greenhouse gas. Come back to that. This is also important because it's converting ammonium, which is pretty stable in the soils, to nitrate, which is more easily lost from ecosystems. So ammonium you see under most pHs is positively charged. Clays are negatively charged in general, so in soils the ammonium pretty much sticks around. It doesn't leak out as much. Once it's converted to nitrate, this stuff moves in soils much faster, so it's more prone to being leached out of the system, so losses through streams, runoff. And then also, once you have it in the form of nitrate, it can be lost in these gaseous forms, the denitrification, which can go all the way back to N2 gas to complete the cycle, or it also has all these intermediate steps. The only one I'm putting out here because it's important. Because the greenhouse gas is nitrous oxide N2O. So those are the major changes in oxidation state of nitrogen. And then here, this is the internal cycling I was talking about. So nitrogen going into organic nitrogen because it's being taken up by organisms. And then that's called immobilization because it's being made unavailable. It's being taken out of the soil pore water or the ocean water, whatever system we're talking about, into cells, microbes or plants, and then that gets broken down through the process of mineralization, which means converting organic to inorganic forms, or mineral forms, inorganic forms. Mostly that produces ammonium because, like we were just talking about, nitrogen is mainly in the form of amino acids in cells, so it's already pretty much in this reduced form. Some can get spat out directly as nitrate, but again, I try to keep this simple. So this stuff here in the middle is internal cycling, like I had in the previous graph. This is an aerobic process where microbes are using it to make energy. They're oxidizing these things as energy. Here's an anaerobic process because they're using nitrate as their alternative electron acceptor. So that just helps you understand where or when these things take place. In soils after it rains and it gets kind of waterlogged and anaerobic, these microbes might start using the nitrate once they're out of oxygen and make these gaseous forms. Okay. That's an overview of chemically what's happening. Here's look at the roots of a legume of some sort. So you all know what legumes are. It's a plant family. It includes lots of yummy stuff. Peas, beans, or if you're interested in our local flora, we have cupins, lotus, a few other. There's one particular important family, like Leguminosae or whatever, that form relationships with end-producing bacteria, generically known as rhizobia, and they live in these little nodules. And there's a lot of really interesting interactions between the plants and the microbes. But these guys are responsible. These plants feed these guys carbon, because again, nitrogen fixation is a really expensive process, and this is a great arrangement. The plants get nitrogen, which is usually what they need. The microbes get carbon, so it's a really good deal for both of the mutualists there. There's also free-living microbes, for example, these cyanobacteria that can live freely in the ocean or in ponds, and many other bacteria that can do it without a host. But we'll see that in agriculture in particular, there's a lot of important crops that are nitrogen fixing. They've really changed. It's one way agriculture has really changed nitrogen. More and more of these plants. Okay, so moving on to how are humans messing with the nitrogen cycle? This is a relatively recent review. These numbers have changed a little bit, but I really like this table because they put together their best estimate of what the nitrogen cycle looked like in 1860 versus the early 1990s, all the data that was available when they published this paper, and then projections into the middle of this current century. So, and ours use reactive nitrogen, meaning anything other than N2 gas. So we're looking at the rates in teragrams of nitrogen per year, so the same rates you saw in that first global nitrogen cycle diagram. There's lightning, biological nitrogen fixation, so what PNF is on land and sea. And then this is the industrial process. You'll see in 1860 didn't exist yet. And what's the impact of human activities since 1860? So the Haber-Bosch process was invented around that time or shortly thereafter. And you can see how it's affected nitrogen. So lightning, that's a poorly understood process. It hasn't really changed much. We expect more change. Notice that so this is the natural. Notice that terrestrial biological nitrogen fixation seems to have dropped a little bit. Why do you suppose that is? And there's a hint down here. So they've separated biological nitrogen fixation into terrestrial, marine, and cultivation. And so why would natural N fixation have gone down since 1860? Yeah, land use change, deforestation, or maybe forests are the most nitrogen-fixing spots in the world. But yeah, loss of natural ecosystems and being replaced by agricultural ecosystems. So we'll see that the natural stuff has gone down a little bit, but it's been more than replaced by, soy, for example. Really important and fixing crop. A lot of soy, other stuff. As far as they know, the marine and fixation hasn't changed, and they don't really know in the future what it'll do. There are some interesting studies going on now about how elevated CO2 and other things might affect nitrogen fixation in the oceans, but they certainly don't know. So at the moment, they're just being sort of keeping it in projections in 2021. But this continued loss of wildlands is driving this decrease from 107 to 98 in the future. Anyway, you can see more biological nitrogen fixation from cultivation and some unintentional stuff from fossil fuel combustion. So you know, cars produce enough heat that some NOx are produced, nitrous oxides of various sorts. And Haber-Bosch, this is a really big one. So to fertilize crops for the growing world population, there's 100 in the early 1990s, that's just going to keep going up as population increases. So anyway, take-home message. As of the early 1990s, 389 was the total amount of nitrogen being created every year, that is reactive nitrogen entering the biosphere from the atmosphere. And the previous, with the reduced human impacts, we haven't quite doubled yet, but we're getting close to doubling the amount of nitrogen cycling through the biosphere. This is from the IPCC, and it shows it graphically. You can see, okay, so here's where the Haber-Bosch process really took off. 1950s, boom. And that drove the overall creation of nitrogen. Basically follows this fertilizer production. And then there's a little bit of increase, say yes, soy crops and stuff like that, and fossil fuel. But you can see that really it's that production of fertilizer. So that's the most obvious thing. Humans are making fertilizer, dumping it on the planet, and so there's a lot more nitrogen cycling now. So here are, I have 3 slides from this IPCC 2013 report on the nitrogen cycle. This is just first looking at nitrogen gas. The red bars, red arrows are showing human impacts. The black arrows are estimates of the natural processes in the absence of human activity. And it's pretty similar to what I showed you in that first graph, but more up-to-date numbers. But you can see, so yeah, there's cultivated fixation here, industrial fixation by the Haber-Bosch process, fossil fuel combustion. So now we add all of these numbers, 60, 124, 30, what is that? It's like 214 teragrams in red, compared to natural biological fixation, which is about, yeah, so according to this, we have doubled the amount of nitrogen that's flowing through the system. Something pretty close to that. So it's pretty comparable to what estimates of natural rates. So a lot more nitrogen flowing. This is looking at reactive nitrogen species other than N2O. N2O we'll get to last because it's an important greenhouse gas. But here we're talking about basically nitrogen pollution and deposition. You hear that a lot. Nitrogen deposition. So you can see the industrial activity, so NOx emissions from fossil fuels, a little from biomass burning, and a lot from like feedlots, for example. Agricultural sewage, agriculture and sewage produce a lot of ammonia. And so we have a lot of cows in particular who tend to get a lot of, and pigs produce a lot of stuff. So you have a lot of these, they separate them out into oxidized versus reduced forms, but the stuff is coming down, and these sort of, whatever that, what's that icky color, what you call that? Puce? No, it's chartreuse, kind of olive, baby poop color. Anyway, this is sort of a gray area because we have a hard idea of going what's natural, what's anthropogenic, and historical rates of how much used to come down before industrial times are hard to get at. So we're in that intermediate color to say that humans are probably have a lot to do with this. But end deposition is this is another way that we're unintentionally fertilizing the planet, in addition to all that Haber-Bosch stuff. And here's just a pretty picture showing you the hot spots of nitrogen deposition. So that red and really dark colors are where you have, up to 60 or more kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. So you see the eastern seaboard of the US hit pretty hard, LA. A lot of this has to do with the way the wind patterns are. It's not just where the stuff's being produced, but also, and so one, also doesn't rain much here too, is the other thing. We have dry deposition and wet deposition, but where it rains more, you tend to get more of the stuff falling. There's parts of Europe that are in really bad shape. You can't even really see it, but I think in like the Netherlands, they have some of the highest rates in the world because they have a lot of agriculture, a lot of cows. So it's cows and cars and industry, and you can see actually most of the world is affected by end deposition. I've heard that one of the cleanest places, the cleanest air, if you get to the west coast of South America, there's this breeze that's just going across the Pacific there. It's pretty clean air. It's like Oregon's doing pretty well too. Anyway, so globally, really big impact. So what is this going to do to, we'll talk about what this does to ecosystems here and downstream. First, let me finish up with some global stuff. So the last graph from the IPCC I have here is N2O nitrous oxide. This is separated out in its own figure because this is a strong greenhouse gas, traps heat, just like CO2 in methane. This is a really complex one. You know, for CO2, we have a really good idea of where that comes from, right? Like, burn fossil fuels that make CO2. It's pretty easy to do an accounting of that. You see all these red arrows. You can see a lot of different things happening. Agriculture is the biggest single one of human influence. So 4.1 is that number there if you never read it. And then there's soils. So there are, you know, the natural amount, 6.6 teragrams per year from soils. Tropical soils in particular are big sources. What they've attempted to do now, though, is separate out the natural amount of N2O production from environments, from the ocean, and from soils, versus what's happening because of end deposition on these environments. So this is the estimate of how much these fluxes have increased because of additional nitrogen that these ecosystems are receiving. So you dump more nitrogen in the ecosystem, the nitrogen cycle just goes around. And if you, real quick, I'm going to go back to my nitrogen cycle diagram here. You'll notice that there's two steps here to make nitrogen, N2O, nitrous oxide. So this step and that step are both making N2O. So if you add more and more ammonia, more nitrate to the system, and this just goes around more and more N2O is produced, right? So it's pretty simple, just driving the nitrogen cycle around more times per year, you end up with more of these byproducts being produced. So some are producing fossil fuels, but this has actually been regulated pretty well. So we're actually controlling the amount of emissions directly from cars and from factories. The biggest impacts are coming sort of unintentionally from having more nitrogen floating around the biosphere. And of course agriculture, because those are heavily fertilized systems, and so they lose a lot of N2O gas. So a bit more on N2O. How much industrialized pockets? I don't know how we're splitting up these two climate change lectures, so have you heard much about N2O yet? No? Okay. Well, a little redundancy won't hurt you. Make it easier to study for the exam anyway. He talks about it Monday. This is an important greenhouse gas. It's present, it's a trace gas. It's present in only parts per billion. So if you can see this, this is showing N2O from, I believe, ice cores back to the year 1000, and then instead it's just modern times. And this parts per billion as the y-axis here. If you remember, CO2 we're in parts per million. So this is about 1,000 times less N2O in the atmosphere as there is CO2. But it's more, it's a stronger greenhouse gas. So depending on how you calculate it, you can say it's about 300 times worse than CO2. That's over a 100-year window. It has a really long lifetime in the atmosphere. It sticks sticks around long, so a long mean residence time. And so when you have it in the atmosphere, it traps heat for quite a long time. And like I said already, it's a side product in both of these steps of the nitrogen cycle, both the aerobic and anaerobic phases, nitrification and denitrification. So as an estimate to how much it's contributing right now to, so radiative forcing, that means how much heat is it trapping in the atmosphere. These are the most recent estimates. This would be CO2. These are some kind of energy units, like watts for something. But anyway, you can see that N2O at the moment is about 10 as much as CO2. So it's a concern. It's not as important as methane or CO2 yet, but it is measurable, and so it's something we're keeping an eye on. Because it is a strong greenhouse gas with a really long lifetime, long mean residence time in the atmosphere. And so that's why we care about N2O. It traps heat effectively. So now let's start talking about sort of ecosystem effects. Talk globally about how humans are adding more nitrogen to the planet, taking it basically out of the atmosphere and putting it into the biosphere. So here's, it's kind of a messy graph, but you see the trend that they're going for here. This is, it's a bad graphic, sorry. This is nitrogen input into ecosystems, grams of nitrogen per meter squared per year on the x-axis. Net primary productivity, carbon units on the y-axis. These are log scales, by the way. So this is compressing really many orders of magnitude difference in nitrogen input to the ecosystem and in productivity. But so I guess ignoring the large amount of noise you see on this, what pattern, how would you describe this pattern? Let's just start off with the left half of the graph. What's the relationship between N input and productivity just for the left half of the graph? Positive, negative, or neutral? Draw a line through it. Do a mental correlation. What do you think? Well, yeah, so, yeah, right, so I was going to break it down. But yeah, basically, if you fit a line to this, sure it's messy, there's other things driving productivity other than just nitrogen input. But as you increase nitrogen to a certain point, the productivity tends to go up. But out here, once you have enough nitrogen, it doesn't seem to increase productivity much at all, right? So when I said that most terrestrial ecosystems, certainly ones in the temperate, mid to high latitudes, are nitrogen limited, eventually you get to a point where you add more and more nitrogen, the plants are no longer nitrogen. We call that nitrogen saturation. They've had as much as they can take up. So at that point, so to a certain point, the plants will just say, thank you for the pollution, that's great, I'll just grow them. Then at a certain point though, the plants have as much nitrogen as they can need, and they'll be limited by something else at that point. What they found actually in some of those heavily nitrogen polluted forests in Europe, for example, micronutrients start becoming important. That's a combined, it's a little complex because not only do they have a ton of nitrogen now, but that's been acidifying the soils and leaching out some of the valuable micronutrients like calcium, for example. So, magnesium, manganese. So that's something that can happen. We have too much nitrogen, we're going to be limited by something else. So what happens then when an ecosystem can no longer absorb the nitrogen that's being deposited on it from the atmosphere? Well, what do you think is going to happen? Let's say you've got an ecosystem. It's been, for the last 50 years, been dumping nitrogen on it. Originally, you get more growth because they were nitrogen. Well, what's going to happen to the streams coming out of that ecosystem when you hit saturation? It can't take it up anymore, so more stays in the soil, and more gets flushed out. And so you're going to end up seeing some downstream effects. So I'll talk about the downstream effects, and here's another one that's an important effect. This is in a tropical forest and shows how it's going to affect the nitrogen cycle and the microbes there. Tropics, like I said, often tropical soils are phosphorus limited instead of nitrogen limited, but both N-limited forests and phosphorus limited forests both N-limited and phosphorus limited forests exist in tropical regions. This was a classic study that added nitrogen experimentally to a forest that they knew where the vegetation was nitrogen limited, and to a forest where they knew the vegetation was phosphorus limited. And they looked for N2O fluxes from the soils. And so there's like some controls down there and a couple different levels of nitrogen added. But basically what you can see is in the phosphorus limited forest, adding nitrogen made this big pulse of N2O. Not nearly as impressive in the nitrogen. So where did the nitrogen go? So here they are in a forest, it's nitrogen limited, they added nitrogen. Where did the nitrogen go? Into the trees. There wasn't as much left over for the microbes that are carrying out this denitrification, or probably denitrification, the processes that make N2O. Whereas the phosphorus limited forest, the plants weren't doing anything with it, so it accumulated to the soil, and the microbes went crazy making more N2O gas. So that's one thing that happens when you add more nitrogen to a nitrogen saturated system. And then of course you get green slime downstream. So eutrophication, is this a term you've been introduced to yet? Eutrophication, yes, no, okay, well I'll say it anyway. It means truly well fed. So it means, as opposed to oligotrophic, which would have really low amounts of nutrients, eutrophic means it's getting a lot of fertilizer. So this can happen from phosphorus or nitrogen, for the most part, those two things are what cause this, but this causes a lot of problems. You get a big bloom of algae, then that algae dies, sinks to the bottom, and as it's getting decomposed, it uses all the oxygen in this body of water, and that can lead to fish kills because the decomposition of all that carbon that's entering the ecosystem, it consumes a lot of oxygen and can basically trash the ecosystem. You end up with killing a lot of fish that are asphyxiated. So that happens in freshwater, but actually it also happens in coastal areas. So these are different types of, so hypoxic meaning low oxygen. So like I said, that's what results when you add a lot of fertilizer, you get a bloom of algae, decomposes, uses up oxygen. So check out in the US, what's happening there? The Mississippi River, that's exactly right. The Mississippi has a lot of agriculture in it. I mean, along the entire length of it, right? And so by the time it exits into the Gulf there, it's pretty rich in nitrogen. And that little dot there's probably sewage from LA, I'm guessing. Could be San Diego, but they're bigger. And so anyway, all around the planet there's a lot of places where, in really populated areas of the coast, and really, what coasts aren't well populated? I mean, that's where humans like to live around coasts for the most part. So where rivers come out, or where sewage effluent comes out, you occasionally get these events of hypoxia, blooms that lead to, and this can decrease, so it can kill fish and reduce the diversity. I stole this from someone named Dr. Harrison, I forgot his name. Thanks to Dr. Harrison for this one. One fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish, one fish. This, by the way, is a red tide. You can, in addition to this oxygen problem, you can also get harmful algal blooms that can be toxic, for example. Personally, I love red tides. Anybody see a red tide? Great. Not all of them are toxic. There are some dinoflagellates in there that can produce neurotoxins, and that can go up the food chain. There's others that make a pretty red color, or I'm sorry, the pretty blue color. They're red in the day, but they bind in the nests at night with like a nice bluish green. They're not all toxic, but some of them are and can cause large problems. So okay, that's those are some impacts of excess nitrogen entering ecosystems. Also on land, and deposition can reduce diversity in plant ecosystems. So this is a series of experimental plots that Tillman and others have, Dave Tillman. I don't know if you may have seen some results from these same experiments where they were manipulating plant diversity and seeing how it affected productivity. But again, it's something I like to teach when I teach this class, but knows? At any rate, these are a bunch of plots that they have added nitrogen to at different levels, and you can see that the species richness declines as they add more and more nitrogen. So can someone sort of imagine, what do you think is going on in these really high nitrogen plants? And what do you think that plant community looks like? Just to help you understand why this happens. Imagine when you add the most amount of nitrogen, what kind of plants are growing in the background? Biggest or fast-growing weedy types, right? So these are the really strong competitors that, so I would tend to think that are selected really weedy types that can grow really fast as long as there's a lot of nutrients. And so they will grow really fast and dominate the ecosystem. At low nitrogen, you can have, that would look more like our native ecosystems where you have slow-growing, stress-tolerant things that not as strong competitively. They're not completely shading out everything. They're just making a living growing very slowly on the small amount of resources that are available. So this is something you tend to see in really high nitrogen systems. You get dominated by a few fast-growing things that just shade out everything else, not completely. All right, this is a local picture. In San Diego, we actually do reasonably well for our nitrogen deposition. This red spot, these are the San Gabriel Mountains by LA. It's where the worst stuff is. But we still have some pretty good shrublands out here that are not that heavy. So there's a lot of research now comparing shrublands in San Diego County and Riverside County compared to San Gabriel to see how these affect plant communities. And this might have an impact on invasive plants. We have a big problem with invasive plants in Southern California, and adding nitrogen could potentially make them grow faster out of our natives. The very last thing I want to mention is there can be human health impacts of having excess nitrogen. When it hits the groundwater and you have nitrogen, so this is from the EPA, nitrate levels in drinking water in parts per million. I know those of you who pay attention to your water bill, every once in a while they have a little report of what's in your drinking water. Kind of fascinating. I don't think San Diego tends to be too bad, although, yeah, it's hard to tell these maps. That's probably, is that LA? It's probably at any rate, nitrate can react with some organic compounds and make carcinogens. So it's a human health issue as well. So in addition to all those ecosystem effects, global change effects, there are human health effects.
Are those numbers in excess of the allowable limits?
No, they are raw numbers. So I'm afraid I don't remember what the. But yes, are those numbers? Yes. These numbers, I believe 10. I think 10 parts per million is the allowable amount. So I didn't understand your question. Yes. So yes, I believe all of these things are instances where the nitrate levels exceeded the EPA guidelines, which I think are 10 parts per million. So right, so these are probably events. These are things that have happened. Various methods over there. I'm sort of going to have the rest of the context for this, like over what period of time and when this data was collected. But yeah, so those are all basically violations, various water. So I seem to have finished 5 minutes early, which is fine for me. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm also happy to let you go.
No, 30,000.